All right, so it is indeed a dangerous escalation because this conflict between Iran and Israel is quite clearly a hot war. But how long can it actually go on? To help decode this, we joined this broadcast by Mr. Edward P. Joseph. He's joining us live from Washington, D.C. He's a foreign policy analyst and also a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University. Professor Joseph, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on WION. Let me start off by asking you this. Considering the unprecedented nature of attack and counterattack that has happened in the last 36 hours, in your assessment, how further do you think Iran and Israel would like to take this conflict?
First, Mohammed, good to be with you and your viewers. And of course, that's the question that everyone wants to know. And of course, no one can know the answer. No one can know how this conflict will escalate or how exactly it will finish. It's not possible to know that now. But one thing is we can say, Mohammed, is this is not unprecedented. Israel has taken action before preemptively to take out nuclear threats, and that is would-be nuclear reactors in neighboring countries, and those attacks have proved successful. That was in both Iraq and in Syria. And repercussions were generally minor from that, and the region is more stable as a result. In this case, of course, we don't know exactly how this will escalate. Iran has sent these missile attacks into Israel. Very few of them have made contact, but there have been some fatalities, and apparently, not fatalities, there have been injuries, and apparently there's one Israeli who's in critical condition. But for this, at the moment, we don't know. We know that Prime Minister Netanyahu has stated that Israel will continue the attacks until it achieves its objectives. Please.
Right. Now, the reason why I said unprecedented, because never in the history of the State of Israel has it been hit in the manner that it has been hit in the last 12 hours with ballistic missiles that Iran has carried out as part of its Operation True Promise 3. Now, the question that I want to ask you, Professor Joseph, is this. The fact that the Israelis went and tried to bomb some of these Iranian nuclear facilities, the IAEA says that attacking nuclear facilities of another nation is illegal as per international law. The IAEA chief, Rafael Grossi, has said this in the context of Ukraine, and has also said this in the context of Iran. In your assessment, has Israel broken the law by staging attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities?
Well, I'm not sure that IAEA Chief Grossi has stated that Israel has broken the law. What he stated
He has said that it is illegal to stage attacks on another country's nuclear facilities.
Well, he's also stated that there have been no serious radiation leaks from or any type of emanation of radioactive material from the attacks so far. That's what Mr. Rossi has stated. As to the legalities of it, it's quite interesting, Mohammed, to note the international reaction here is relatively muted. We don't see demands that often are made, historical demands, for example, to have emergency sessions in the Security Council and moves to condemn. Prime Minister Netanyahu has spoken with several key leaders of the major powers in the world, and that includes, I should note here, India. So Prime Minister Netanyahu and Prime Minister Modi have spoken directly, and the reaction is, in my view, actually surprisingly muted. We heard Keir Starmer talk about Israel's right to self-defense, and at the same time calling for Israel and Iran not to escalate. Obviously, no one's interested, including here in the United States, is to see this escalate into some type of regional war. Please.
Absolutely, indeed. The Indian Prime Minister, he had the phone call with the Israeli Prime Minister when Netanyahu called him, and the Indian Prime Minister, of course, called for restraint and for better sense to prevail on all sides. Professor Joseph, I want you to, in fact, weigh in on the level of American involvement in what has happened in the last 36 hours. In your assessment, considering the kind of very special relationship that the Israelis and the Americans have, do you think it is possible that Netanyahu could have carried out Operation Rising Lion without the express involvement or at least the consent of the American leadership?
Again, a very important question, and it's important to distinguish between those two, between consent and information. Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke with President Trump, and President Trump indicates that he was informed about this. He doesn't say that he was taken by surprise. He indicates that he was informed. At the same time, Secretary of State Rubio has made it very clear that the U.S. is not part of this operation. So that is the twin messaging here, is that yes, there was a phone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. Apparently, Prime Minister Netanyahu did signal at least something to President Trump about this type of imminent action. And at the same time, the United States is not involved in the operation itself. Now, the U.S. is helping Israel with defense. So that's from Iranian counterattacks, but is not involved in the operation. And again, Secretary Rubio made it clear that the U.S. is not involved in that sense.
You know, but the one thing that the Americans were very clearly involved were these negotiations that had been ongoing for the last several weeks. Donald Trump had in fact taken it upon himself, where he said that he wanted things to be sorted out through negotiations. At a time when the United States and Iran were engaged in these negotiations, the state of Israel under Netanyahu has gone ahead and carried out these, what it describes as preemptive strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities, along with decapitating the Iranian military leadership. With this having been done, do we now say that the possibility of talks resulting in any kind of a nuclear deal are effectively dead and buried?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. In fact, President Trump doesn't say that. What President Trump said here is quite interesting. He said prior to the attack, he said, well, I don't want to see an Israeli attack because that could blow it. That means it could blow the talks. And then he quickly added, at the same time, maybe the attacks could help the talks. He added that at the same time. This was in advance of the talks. Now, in his reaction to the strikes, he's called them excellent, and he has focused, Mohammed, on the very question that you raised. President Trump has focused on the need. He's urged Iran to make a deal now before it gets any worse for Iran. So that's the posture of the U.S. is that some type of a deal could very much be reached. Now the question is, under what terms would Iran? What terms would Iran accept? And the key question there is enrichment. And yes, Mohammed, there were 5 meetings already. We should point this out to your viewers. There were 5 meetings between the Trump administration already and Iran on it without very much progress. In fact, the U.S. had indicated the Iranian position was hardening. And let me finally add here that the Biden administration had negotiated without any military pressure whatsoever on Iran for 4 years, all during President Biden's term as recent U.S. president, from the beginning, trying to get Iran to agree to go back into the nuclear deal signed in 2015 under President Obama. And that effort, which was a effort, again, without any military pressure, without mounting additional sanctions or anything like that, also failed. The Iranians refused to get back into the Iran nuclear deal with a U.S. administration that was not trying to mount this type of pressure. Please.
Right. That's an important point that you've brought up, Professor Joseph, because there was already an Iranian nuclear deal in place that was struck by the Obama administration back in 2015. And when Donald Trump took over in 2018, he unilaterally walked out of the deal, describing it to be the worst negotiated deal in American history. And it is since then that the Iranians decided that because the Americans were not willing to play ball and had walked out of a deal that the Americans had signed themselves because there was a change of guard at the White House, they started, and in a calibrated manner, started to flout the terms of those deals. So the question that I want to ask you is this: when the negotiations were on at this moment, the possibility that there could have been a deal that was different from what was already in place as part of the JCPOA, how likely was that the Trump administration was willing to sign a deal that was very, if not similar, but very different to what was already in place in 2018?
Again, Mohammed, it's not exactly clear, if I understand your question correctly, what the precise position is of the
No, my question
Trump
is this. My question, very simply is this. How different do you think the deal that was on offer by the Trump administration now from the deal that Donald Trump walked out in the 2018 agreement?
I do understand that question, and I'll tell you my understanding of the answer is that the administration's position, the exact position of the Trump administration on the terms, altered somewhat. It's not entirely clear, but it does appear that the position of the Trump administration was to stop enrichment.
Right.
That there was going to be a more of an, and that's a change from the JCPOA that was signed in 2015, which permitted that under IAEA, very strict IAEA inspection. And we know, of course, we should add here that IAEA itself just recently criticized Iran again for violations and frustrating the efforts of the IAEA inspectors to access certain areas, and criticized, as you mentioned, the flouting the terms of the agreement. And I mention again here, it's worth saying it again, Mohammed, that the Biden administration desperately wanted to get back into that deal free from these type of threats, military pressures or additional financial pressures. In fact, there was monies, the substantial amount of money was returned to Iran under the Biden administration, under the terms of the deal. These were monies that were held in South Korea. And there was a deal, and these significant amount of sums went back to Tehran during the Biden administration, but they were unable, as much as President Biden wanted to get Iran to get back into the JCPOA. Please.
Right. I think that's a very fair point that you're making, that under the Biden administration, there were efforts that were, of course, made to try and get back into the deal. That did not work out. But to talk about what's been happening in the last 36 hours, Professor Joseph, the fear has been that the United States of America, though it is not actively involved in the confrontation that is playing out between Iran and Israel, because the United States has a duty towards its ally, the State of Israel, could get sucked into an all-out war with Iran, a war that America does not necessarily want to fight. In your assessment, how real do you think this possibility is?
I think here in Washington, I think there is a lot of concern about that. And I think there are views, particularly in the Republican Party, a lot of concerns, I think, and in the Democratic Party as well, about being sucked into another war in the Middle East. And again, I think no one wants to see that. At the same time, there is strong support, even among those Republicans who are worried about this, Mohammed. What you correctly say is a concern about being sucked into another war. There's widespread support for Israel's actions. I mean, there was the quote by Steve Bannon, of course, the famous former and still an advisor informally to President Trump, who is among those warning about and worried about getting sucked in. But he said Israel did what it had to do to protect itself. It looked after its interests first, and the United States should look after its interests first. So he's not condemning or criticizing Israel's actions, but he's cautioning President Trump about the move forward. And so here we look to Iran's own reaction here. We know, for example, Mohammed, that the U.S. troops in the Middle East, that in Iraq and in Syria, and that in the past, militias, Shiite militias aligned with Iran, particularly in Iraq, have attacked these soldiers. And in Jordan, some soldiers were killed by an attack. So that remains a question for Tehran, how it would respond, because presumably the leaders in Iran have no interest as well in seeing this escalate, because if it does, the U.S. has capabilities military capabilities that Israel does not. And this, we come to this key question of the nuclear plant, suspected nuclear plant at Fordo, which is a half-mile underground.
Absolutely.
Mohammed, and that's beneath exceeds the capacity of Israel's arsenal to get at that facility. And so Iran would really be risking a lot depending on its reaction. And if it goes after or has its proxies and militias go after U.S. troops, then Iran is really rolling the dice.
Right, but so far, the Iranians have not gone after the American troops that are stationed in the region. There are anywhere an estimate of 30 to 40 plus thousand American troops in the Middle East that are stationed there, nor has Iran done anything to affect the flow of oil through the Persian Gulf. But at this moment, looking as to how the chessboard, if one can call it that, has been laid out, Professor Joseph, the fact is, this appears to be a calculated escalation up the escalatory ladder, where the Iranians have hit back at the Israelis, and now the ball is in Israel's court. In your assessment, in the aftermath of these attacks that were carried out in Tel Aviv and other cities across the state of Israel, these ballistic missile attacks, do you think Netanyahu would now be compelled to hit back at Iran again?
Mohammed, I wouldn't characterize it like that, because even if Iran had done nothing so far, it would appear that under Prime Minister Netanyahu's vision, Israel hasn't yet achieved its military objectives. And let's remember here, it's while Iran is throwing missiles at civilian areas, Israel is focused on, it doesn't mean there are not other casualties, but it's focused on military objectives. It's, as your report indicated, taking out the remaining air defense artillery, taking out the military leadership, and of course, taking out part of Iran's nuclear weapons program, which of course it denies that it has, but it's proven that it does have, the proof is there that it does have a nuclear weapons program. So the Israeli actions, I don't think are going to be that much affected by these missile attacks on civilian areas. If, for example, I don't see Israel retaliating by going after Iranian civilians. I think that's not in line.
A lot of people, Professor Joseph, a lot of people, in fact, point out,
Mohammed, they will
a lot of people, if I can just make a quick point there, a lot of people will point out to what Israel has done in the Gaza Strip, and they would say that it is not that Israel has always shied away from attacking areas that are densely populated by the civilians.
Yes. Okay, Mohammed, we shift here.
No, I was just making a point when you said that the Israelis are focused only on military targets.
Yes, let me respond to that. First,
go ahead.
There's an irony. The irony is, and let's certainly hope that this it comes to fruition, is that this operation in Iran could perhaps lead Prime Minister Netanyahu to regardless of whether he can agree and come to terms through mediation with Hamas, terminate the operation or scale it down and hopefully achieve a ceasefire in Gaza that the civilians there desperately need. We all know that. The civilians in Gaza desperately need that. And of course, Mohammed, we know, you know, everyone knows that Hamas deliberately mixes in with the civilian population to attract and incur civilian casualties, and that's a fact that's widely known. Please.
All right, but I want to draw your attention back to what is happening at this moment between Iran and Israel, although Gaza continues to be a very, very important issue, and Israel is very actively militarily involved there as well. From the American perspective, do you think the path forward for a negotiated settlement for an Iranian nuclear deal, do you think the American position has been changing from the time the negotiations began? Because at the beginning of the negotiations, Donald Trump had said that the only thing that he does not want the Iranians to have is a nuclear weapon. They could do whatever else that they could. But subsequent to that, the position that was taken by Steve Witkoff, the special representative of the Americans, is that the Iranians could not even carry out enrichment. But the Iranians have been saying that the this goes against their sovereignty, their rights of sovereignty, because enrichment for a civilian nuclear program is something they should be allowed to pursue like any other nation that pursues nuclear technology. In your assessment, will this particular clause of whether to be allowed to enrich and to what extent be the undoing of these entire efforts for a deal that could be struck between the Americans and the Iranians?
First, Mohammed, it's simply not clear. The answer to that, the first part of your question, which is what exactly was the position of the Trump administration? And as I noted before, it appears that they were moving in the direction of curtailing Iranians' enrichment. Iranian enrichment. It appears that they were trying to curtail that. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. What the actual modalities are to curtail Iranian enrichment there of uranium. So that part again remains not exactly clear. Again, the reports by the president of the United States, Donald Trump himself, were that the Iranian position in the talks, these 5 talks that they had, was hardening. Now, more widely, okay, let's respond to this question about, well, it's Iran's sovereign right, like any other country, to have the right to enrichment and a civilian nuclear program. Well, we're talking about a country that has repeatedly demonstrated bad faith, and this is not just based on U.S. intelligence or Israeli intelligence. This is based on the reports of the IAEA itself, including most recently, in his most recent comments by Mr. Grossi himself. So we're talking about a country that has denied repeatedly that it has a nuclear weapons program when it does have one. And when it's shown, and when also it continues to flout the terms, its obligations under its commitments to the IAEA, and when it clearly has demonstrated aggressive interests, not just towards Israel, but the wider Middle East, which is why we do not, again, here, Mohammed, it's interesting, we don't see some huge reaction in Saudi Arabia, in the United Arab Emirates, in...
Professor Joseph, these are nations that will not react, because these nations are clearly the rivals of Iran, and they're more allied to the American position within the region. But talking about negotiating in good faith, the Iranians will turn around and say that, listen, we were negotiating with the Americans. The American leadership was saying that there would not be a military attack. But instead, what we are looking at this moment is that the person who was carrying out the negotiations with his American counterpart has now been killed by the Israelis in the decapitation attack that they've carried out on the Iranian military leadership. That does not point to negotiations with good faith, because these attacks were carried out by America's closest ally in the region. How do you respond to what the Iranians have to say here?
I think it's a legitimate point. I think it's legitimate to point out that the Iranian negotiator was taken out. At the same time, it's not the United States that did that action, and we simply don't know whether Prime Minister Netanyahu stated to President Trump, "Oh, by the way, we're conducting an operation, and this is exactly what we're going to do." This was not the U.S. Secretary Rubio, again, made that very clear. This was not a U.S. operation. The U.S. did not do this. This was Israel that did this. And but your other point, I think, is also valid. Mohammed, you mentioned this earlier, is that, yes, it's true that Iran signed the JCPOA, and that the U.S. also did back in 2015, along with its partners there in the UN Security Council, plus Germany, all signed that agreement, the Europeans as well. And Donald Trump walked out of that deal while the Iranians were implementing it. And I think that that's a fact that no one should deny. And then in place, Donald Trump put, in his first administration, put on the pressure campaign, maximum pressure on Iran. So
Right.
that's true. But again, the other truth is President Biden, who was President Obama's vice president and who supported the JCPOA, tried his entire 4 years from the beginning to work with Iran, to work and address Iranian concerns and anxieties just to get, without the pressures, and certainly no threat of any Israeli military strike or U.S. military strike, to get Iran to go back into the JCPOA, and Tehran refused to do so. Please.
All right. We are completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Edward P. Joseph, for joining us from Washington, D.C., and getting us that very comprehensive perspective, because as things stand, they stand on a razor's edge. What has been happening in the last 24, 36 hours has effectively pushed the entire region of West Asia to the brink. We do not know as to how things will unfold from here. Will there be another round of attacks and counterattacks? Because remember, the Israelis carried out what the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu described as Operation Rising Lion. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.